It is one of the most emotional things for the employees who are being acquired to have that change coming.
Hello, I'm Shirley Kavanagh, and you're very welcome to the Leadership Discoveries podcast, where leaders and experts from across sectors share insights, turning points, and hard-won wisdom that can drive real leadership impact. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Steve Widdoss, Chief People Officer at One Physics, which is headquartered in Maryland in the USA. And Steve has operated at the most senior levels of HR leadership across some of the world's most demanding and complex organisations, from global financial services giants, including JPMorgan Chase, Capital One and Barclays, to pharmaceutical services and to high-growth technology environments. He brings with him a remarkable track record of building, transforming, and at times fundamentally re-engineering people functions under real pressure. And I think what makes Steve's experience particularly interesting is that he knows what really great HR leadership looks like when the organisation is growing fast, restructuring hard, integrating acquisitions, or redesigning how work gets done. And I'm delighted he's joining me here today. Steve, you're very welcome.
Oh, happy to be here. And thanks, Shirley, for the opportunity. Nice to see you again.
Steve, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I know I haven't done you justice with that introduction. Maybe I have, but I think it'd be really interesting to hear about, when you look back at your journey to date as such, is there any sort of common threads that connect those different chapters of that leadership journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say early in my career, if I'm just very blunt, I was driven a lot by ambition and looking for experiences that were going to move me from one area of HR to another in terms of getting the necessary qualifications in place to ultimately run an HR function. So I do think if you're early stage HR, you need to be very deliberate about how you go about that journey if you ultimately want to run an HR function, which I had decided I wanted to do very early in my career. Then once I had gotten established as an HR leader, I started looking really for a variety of different experiences. So my first role running HR was in a small private equity company, about 150 people. And that's where I really cut my teeth on learning how to run an HR function, assessing what the critical areas are and how you kind of go about that. And then from there, kind of looked at roles that sort of stepped up in scale a bit and presented some new challenges along the way. So I think that the common thread in the beginning was, establishing the experience that I needed. Common thread in the back end, I think, was then looking for taking those experiences and applying to different scale organizations, different industries. I always sort of craved something new and always learning. And so I think when I ran that gamut at a lot of organizations, I would potentially make a move. And again, just sort of keeping your interest and keeping things fresh as I kind of went through.
And you have an MBA in finance. Did that come before the decision for HR, or was it after?
If you actually draw the line all the way back, I graduated with a degree in supply chain management and business logistics. So I started on the business side and actually found myself accidentally getting into HR very early in my career as a compensation analyst. It was just a convergence of interest and expertise at the time that drew me from the business over into HR. Very quickly assessed that if you were going to excel as a leader in HR and be taken seriously and have a true seat at the table, you really need to understand the business at a granular level, like at the P&L level, almost like a mini CFO sort of role there. And that prompted me to go get my MBA. So I do have an MBA in finance. And I do think as I went through my HR career, it really differentiated me, one, as a candidate on a very personal level. But two, I think it also accelerated my being accepted by the CEO and the CFO and so on. So many times, particularly in smaller companies, HR tends to sometimes get buried under the finance team or reporting in through another area of the organization. So to have true credibility and step up and be in the C-suite and be viewed as a peer to like a CFO sort of role, you really need to know your business, and then you need to have the ability to really drill down and assess, what levers you can pull to drive, the P&L of the business, whether it is minimizing cost or whether it is optimizing profit on that side. So yeah, long story, the MBA really made a huge difference, both personally and again, I think just getting the credibility that I needed as an HR leader.
Yeah, and that's a really nice segue actually into a topic I really do want to talk to you about. And that is the role of HR in the organization, because it's come from a place of transactional personnel type functions to wanting to be, and I'm not saying it's there, but wanting to be a real strategic HR leader in the organization. And I know you've presented to boards, you've sat in compensation committees, you've very experienced at that level. Are we there yet, do you think, in the world of HR?
Yeah, candidly, I'm not sure that we are. I still feel like I see a lot of variability in how HR is treated in organizations. And to your point, it's still very, very transactional in a lot of companies. And I kind of went through that personal experience in my journey, where I came into an organization and it is still almost like the personnel days there, Shirley. And I've also then experienced it to where we've been able to elevate it into the strategic partnerships. So I think if we do an honest assessment of where HR is as a function, I do think there's a lot of variability. What drives that? I feel like as an HR leader, table stakes is what I term I use flawless execution. If you're not doing all of your HR things at a very, very high level, payroll, recruiting, systems, managing employee relations and issues and so on. If those aren't exceptional, they're never going to be perfect. I say flawless, and it's a word you kind of banter around. They're never going to be perfect, but if you strive for perfection, you'll gain excellence. That's an old sports term from back here in the U.S. You have to have that execution at a level that establishes your credibility. Then it goes back to, you really need to demonstrate an understanding of the business. Like I said, sort of that mini CFO sort of role. And then you have to earn the trust of all your peers. So that when the CEO is talking to your colleagues, they're really touting the value that you're adding to the organization. But I really think the most critical piece in all of that, you can do all of those things. And if you don't have a willing, receptive CEO who's genuinely bought into the idea that HR can drive the company in a strategic direction, you're never really going to break in. If I think about the CEOs I've worked for along the way, I have examples of CEOs who clearly viewed HR as a transactional part of the business, one where the cost should be minimized, and so on. And that's fine. You can lead within that framework. And then I've also worked for some wonderful CEOs who literally would not make a decision about the business, whether HR related or not, without myself at the table, along with our CFO. Almost they kind of call it that power triangle, if you will. So a lot of it comes down to what's the mindset of your CEO, which you can change and influence along the way, but only so much. So that's what I've kind of found in my experience.
Yeah, and you mentioned power triangle there, which I'm interested just to explore that a little bit more with you. Have you been in that power triangle? And what's the triangle look like?
So I have, and it's the CEO, the CFO, and the CHRO or Chief People Officer. So really, it goes back to, does the HR role have equal footing in the organization with the CFO? So the CFO always tends to be on the right hand of the CEO and the one who's really driving the conversation, because obviously CEOs are generally, they're generally incented almost purely based on financial performance of the business, however they achieve that. So the CFO, I think, has a very traditionally strong role in most organizations. Obviously not a triangle when you only have 2 points on the line there. So when you can break in and get that third point with the chief people officer or the HR role, I think it changes the construct of the business because it just puts a bit of a different lens on how you're assessing things. And I do think there's a bit of an influence on like how is your business measured? Like if you're truly in a business that has a long-term focus, it's a lot easier to make decisions that have an ROI that could be 2, 3 years down the road, which is usually, your training programs, your systems investment and so on. They don't do returns in one quarter, right? They do the returns in the long term. So if your CEO and your company are operating in a framework, that is really driven by results on a quarter by quarter by quarter basis, which unfortunately a lot of companies, particularly publicly traded companies, are, you have less room to influence how that strategic outcome is going to happen. If you have a longer term focus, you can get more involved. But it's really about, again, trying to establish HR on equal footing with the finance organization. Not that it's a competition, but in so much that both of those functions are getting equal time with the CEO. That's where you can really start to get into the strategic conversation and move it away from just purely transactional.
It's interesting what you say there, Steve, because I know I think HR people can often find it a challenge to sell into the organization something that has a long term benefit rather than, long term strategic benefit rather than short term. Have you any tips for making that sale in, or is it around making sure you're positioning yourself and that you have a CEO who has the patience, let's say, for those longer term investments?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that credibility establishment that I kind of talked about there too. So if you've demonstrated that you can do the transactional things right, you can do those pieces of it at a very, very high level, and then you can get into the conversation about long-term, return on investment. You always have to come in, and this is where I think HR folks you trip up, and I know that I did early in my career. I think you kind of come in selling a sort of nebulous vision of the future that doesn't have real data and real dollars behind it. So if you really want to get the attention of the CEO, I think you have to sit down and say, if we make this investment of $200,000 in leadership training, then over the course of the next 2 years, that's going to yield $200,000 times X, and that's the way any investment in business is usually assessed based on ROI. So I think a lot of HR leaders don't really understand the value that they're adding. So I did invest, you got to invest a lot of time in really quantifying and measuring how the recommendations and the investments that you're making are going to go back to that P&L that we talked about previously. If you can't demonstrate movement in the P&L for those investments, unless you're making investments strictly for compliance reasons or regulatory reasons, it's going to be hard for those dollars to get invested when the salesperson is coming along and saying, "Hey, if you give me an additional $200,000, I can turn it into $2 million." When there's finite money floating around, you're never going to get there. So you really got to distill it down to the language that they speak, which is return on investment in dollars. That's hard to do in a lot of cases because again, you're dealing with these ambiguous, nebulous, concepts where I say, I'm going to make Shirley a better leader. Well, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And more importantly, how does that translate into more dollars for the company or less costs or more efficiencies? So I think that's kind of how you get there with the CEOs.
Yeah, and Steve, there's a real thread from the very first question I asked you, I think, around that sense of commercial awareness around the organization and being able to speak the language of the organization, understanding the metrics and understanding value, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I read out some companies at the start of this that you have been involved with, and I know you've been involved in others as well. That was just a small sample of them where you've worked, and you've an extensive career behind you. But what I'm curious about is operating at the key HR role in an organization that, let's say, maybe in turnaround versus an organization that could be in a more steady state, if there is such a thing anymore, Steve, but let's say in a more steady state. How have you dealt with that? Or can someone in HR be equally as effective, in one of these areas versus the other? Or is it something that you need to think of, that's the place I'm best working in?
I think what you're kind of speaking to there is adaptability. So you have to bring a variety of experiences and talent and understanding to those different situations. So if you find yourself in an area of rapid expansion, which I did at one point in my career, doubling the size of an organization from say 7,500 employees to 15,000 employees in less than 2 years, that takes motivation. It takes, keeping up a high pace, celebration. It's having fun and it's keeping people focused on those sort of short-term metrics that are going to ultimately yield a long-term goal of doubling the size of an organization. So when you get into that, you have to be almost a cheerleader and it can just a motivator and just continuing to sort of get people to do what's usually an exceptional amount of work in a short period of time. But then when you get into sort of the idea of a contraction, that takes, a lot more planning. Not that expansion doesn't take planning, but when you do a contraction, it tends to have, much more widespread impact to the business. You have to be very, very mindful of that impact because ultimately, you're sort of taking away the livelihood of a lot of people in your organization. It's also a lot about managing emotions because you're going to get hit with negative emotions from leadership. You're going to get negative emotions from employees, negative emotions from external sources who are evaluating your business and just looking at a headline that says X company is laying off 10,000 people or 5% of their workforce. So managing those emotions is very difficult. But then it's also I don't want to say putting blinders on per se, but at some point, there's a job to be done, and it's hard, and then it's not very fun. And being able to be a steady hand when you're going through those very turbulent waters of a contraction or a turnaround, that's where you can add value too, because again, if you look at the most senior leaders in organizations, they're still human beings. They still have fear, they still have trepidation, they still have doubt, and in so much that you can be a steady hand in the background that is helping them hold the wheel of the ship as they're guiding it, that can be really helpful too. So again, I do think there's a whole continuum of experiences you need to draw upon, whether you're in a steady state, whether in an expansion, or whether you're in a contraction of the business. And that's where good HR leadership kind of comes through, the ability to pivot very quickly between those and bring the right experiences to bear when you have to kind of guide those waters.
Yeah, really great point about adaptability. And also that when you mention emotion there, I mean, there's a bit about managing yourself, first of all, through some of these
Oh
things,
yeah.
isn't there? Yeah.
That's where I think experience and longevity helps you a bit, right? Because you've had those different experiences to draw upon. If I look at my 30-year-old self versus my current self, I would say, my early leadership profile had a tint of arrogance in there, and excess emotion and so on. And you learn to kind of, sort of go through those experiences, have maybe some negative experiences that you can then build on that will make you a better leader. And when I look at leadership in some of the companies I've worked for, there is a difference between those new leaders who are in it for the first time and versus seasoned leaders. And a lot of that comes down to managing those emotions in the most appropriate way and reacting to situations in a different way and drawing upon experiences they have and just kind of letting things sit a bit versus reacting. So there's a thing like don't react, respond, and so on. You learn that as you go. You have to make those mistakes, or someone has to pull you aside and teach it to you to be a bit more mindful. So I definitely struggled with some of those, early days, in terms of being a leader, and you kind of have to go through it, and then sort of build that muscle of managing your emotions and recognize when other people are having really negative reactions to situations to help them manage it and also to help yourself not get pulled into it. So.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good advice, Steve. Just on that whole point of transforming organizations, transforming as such, and I know you've been involved in organizations that have been on the acquisition path and have brought in acquisitions. I hear a lot from people who I work with in my practice about this concept of being acquisition ready as such, from a leadership perspective. I'd love to get your view on it because it just strikes me it's so context specific and it's quite nuanced. So can you tell us a little bit about that from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, first and foremost, having your shop in order. So, when you kind of step into an HR organization, you need a stable platform from which to build on. So, again, this goes back to, do you have the appropriate HR systems in place? Are they scalable? Do you have the appropriate processes in place? Are they clearly defined? Does everyone understand their role? And kind of so on down the line. The first piece there to be acquisition ready is having all of your trains running on time and having your stable platform built. Then from there, it's having a defined process for how you're going to manage that acquisition. So I look at the way that I've managed them with the teams that I've led in each vertical, whether it's training, whether it's payroll, compensation, so on down the line. We almost have like an acquisition playbook we just go through sort of the step-by-step process of assessing how we want to bring those organizations in. And I can tell you from experience, I've managed like a 3,000 person integration, which, requires the same amount of planning as a 10-person integration. And it's just, you kind of just do it at a different scale. So you sort of take that process and then duplicate it, over the scale of the organizations. So it's about having your shop in order, and then being very deliberate about the planning of an acquisition. I think folks think it's just gonna, we're just gonna acquire this company and they're just gonna move them in. It is one of the most emotional things for the employees who are being acquired to have that change coming. You're potentially changing their frequency of pay, how they're taxed, their benefits, their 401(k), all those things that are really emotional for people. So it's about clarity. Here's what's going to change. Here's when it's going to change. Here's how it's going to change. And then keeping that promise, because you're trying to build trust with those new employees coming in. Most of the time when you buy a company, you need the employees to stick around. Particularly in the space I'm in now, where we're a very service-oriented organization. Our product is people. And if people leave after an acquisition and they're unhappy, then the whole economics of the acquisition itself falls apart. So it's about managing those expectations, for people as they come across. You're also building trust with your internal people, the people who are there. So they're going to see how you treat this acquisition. Are you treating it as just all right, we're just going to sweep them in here and they're going to do what they're told and everybody move on? Or are you treating them with compassion and respect, and really investing the time for them to understand how this change is going to impact them? When your current employees see the treatment of those new people being exceptional, that helps bolster the culture of your company too. So again, summary, it's about having your shop in order, about really deliberate planning, and about really good communication. And it doesn't matter if it's small or large. I've probably spent more energy on smaller acquisitions than larger ones because you tend to have the real emotional impact right in front of you. Whereas in a larger acquisition, it tends to be more systematized. So you can't underestimate how disruptive they can be, but also don't underestimate the opportunity you have to really influence the culture of the business.
A really important point as well, Steve, just what you were talking about there in terms of your own organization, the acquiring organization, as much as the organization that's being acquired. And sometimes we think about that. Quite honestly, I haven't. That kind of gives me a different context around it, actually, as
Yeah,
well.
it really, I mean, you'd be amazed at in my experience, like how things that you wouldn't believe would impact the way employees perceive your company and how are working there. So there's that acquisition side of it, but also like how do you treat people when they exit the organization? So when you go back to that, discussion we had around when you're doing these massive contractions of the business or even small contractions of the business, you're impacting people that are friends of people who are staying behind. And there's almost a bit of that survivor guilt that folks have. But if they see a person who's exiting the organization being treated in a respectful, compassionate, fair way, their perception of the organization is also elevated because they're the ones who are going to have to stay behind and it's like the work goes away a lot of times in those contractions of the business. A lot of times you're asking people to do more with less. So if they see their friend treated poorly or a colleague treated poorly, it impacts them. And then you start to run into tailing retention issues and a whole bunch of different things. So you just have to be mindful of how you're treating people when they're coming in, equally as mindful of how you're treating people as they're going out. I find as well.
Yeah, really important point. Just on that, it's a nice segue, I suppose, that whole piece about people leaving organizations into talking about technology and the impact of AI in organizations. So, maybe first of all, if we could just talk about, I mean, you're obviously in the States, and same over here on this side of the pond, we're seeing layoffs
Yeah,
due to AI. Can you
sure.
give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's interesting, Shirley. So it's impossible to avoid the headlines, and there is truly just an unprecedented investment from a dollar perspective into AI right now, and it is the future. It is coming, and it is gonna dominate the landscape, similar to like the original internet when it kind of came online, and then how that impact happened there. I do think some of it is sensationalized, my opinion, in terms of the real current impact to jobs and and so on. It's definitely happening in a lot of spaces. People are feeling it. So I feel like it's real, but then some of it is also a bit overblown. So my counsel to leaders that I'm working with is patience. Let's sort of like see how it plays out a bit. We can't ignore it, and I think it's just like any other adoption strategy. You're either an early adopter and and kind of wait, the sort of the tip of the spear, if you will, or you're kind of waiting to see how things shake out. Specific to HR, I was involved in a very early assessment of how can AI help us do our jobs better. And then, are there any areas of HR where AI could potentially replace, headcount and so on? As a bit of a canary in the coal mine, what we found was it's a really, really good accelerator for your current performers. So if you sort of think about the efficiency of how people approach work, of the time they spend on certain things. There are a number of areas of HR where AI is just amazing. So, if anybody has been in HR for any exceptional period of time, you've had to write a job description, which is one of the most painful things in the world. If you go into AI and you say, write me a job description for a compensation manager based in the EU with a focus in the pharmaceutical industry, it'll write a job description for you in 15 seconds. And then you can write an interview guide off that job description in another 15 seconds. And then it will also give you the resume of an ideal candidate in another 15 seconds. So if you think about the hours that would normally be required to do something like that, it's an amazing accelerator. And then you can kind of take that and put it in different areas of HR. I do see, my opinion again, I do see the headcount impact in HR being more of a tail than some immediacy. So if I think about again an organization that has 15 people in their compensation function and that organization is continuing to grow, they may not need to add headcount to meet that increased demand. So I think where you start to really see it is the tail when you draw the line at 4 or 5 years. You might have normally added two or three resources to meet that demand. Now you can meet that demand with your current resources without having a disparate impact on work-life balance and quality of life and so on. So I'm kind of leaning into the AI thing from an HR perspective. I think overall in the industry, it's early days. Like the billions are being invested now. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the capability. There will be some job impact, but with any new technology, there's always new jobs that come up, right? So like, it's like it's the buggy whip, argument that we all kind of learned in business school. Like you could be making the best buggy whips in the world, but when we stop needing buggy whips, you got to start making tires for cars and other engine parts and so on. I think that's where AI ultimately takes us is it creates more opportunity than it does destruction, but you kind of have to have that conflict and so on in order to get to a new and better place. That being said, I would encourage every leader, regardless of where you are in your career on the HR side, to just really be leaning into the AI piece, understanding how it impacts you and your business, because you definitely will get left behind if you don't understand that impact and you just think it's going to kind of go away. It's not going away.
Interesting, because I was just going to ask you about today's leaders, not just HR, but everything. What would you be saying to them? Look, for the future, you really need to be developing this capability. So clearly AI, and as you say, leaning into it and not being afraid of it, and I suppose being curious about it. Is there anything else that kind of strikes you around that piece, because the world is so uncertain at the moment?
Yeah, and again, I categorize myself a bit on the conservative side when it comes to these types of things. I would be waiting for really good data and a really good assessment of how are the AI changes going to impact the specific businesses and specific areas of the business. Clearly, again, I go back to there's definitely immediate opportunity, I think, for accelerating or enhancing every single area of the business. I literally, we just had a board meeting where I had these very, very unattractive looking slides in PowerPoint, and had a colleague come along and say, "Hey, let me take a look at those, and I'll run them through Claude for you." Not to Claude something specific, but it seems pretty amazing. And like the difference between what I did And once you put the AI enhancement on it, night and day doesn't even begin to describe it. It was a piece of art, at the end of it. That's just one small example, but then it helps me communicate a message better to the board. It's much clearer for everyone, and so on. And people aren't trying to decipher these kind of antiquated, presentation documents that you have. So every single area of the business can absolutely benefit from this early generation of AI. It's as simple as the chat availability out there, presentation availability, anything that's kind of word driven and so on. Lean into it now because it's just going to make your business better and it's just going to make you better as a performer. I think you then got to really go deep on, depending upon the business that you're in, can AI like take you to the next level? And I can think about, some examples of that across my, career where making some deep investments in, can you use AI in customer service environments and contact centers and so on to augment or ultimately replace, kind of the reps and make it a better experience for the customer itself. In the case of our business, we have, teams that are like on hand, putting, hands on machines and customers, patients and so on. Very difficult to have AI assess a machine, at least in the current environment. Like now, is that going to change? It probably is. So I think it's in the short term, really going role by role in your organization and challenging people to use the technology to be better, to be more efficient, to do more, because that pressure's never going to go away, and really lean into it in the short term. Then I think it's a pause and looking at your business in particular and what can you invest in the long term. These are usually multi-year projects to get you from A to B. Obviously, you can't get from A to B unless you start somewhere. That's where you can really, I think see the value of it. But it's going to be business to business. It's going to be function to function. And candidly, it's going to be role to role, when you really distill down on can you do it with AI or can you not?
What about the human element, Steve? Where do you see the human still, or the human leadership skills, let's call them, still being really, really important in the future?
Well, I don't think they ever go away, honestly. I think the way we do things and I think the how we do things will continue to change at a pace that none of us can even perceive or see right now. So if you look 20 years out, I don't even think we know what's going to happen in any way, shape, or form, and people are speculating on it and so on. You're never going to completely remove the human aspect of things because you're going to need people to build those teams. So a talent assessment and so on. You're going to need people then to lead those teams. There's always going to be challenges to that. So I don't think the human element ever fully goes away. And then again, there's just, at least in this evolution of AI, there's certain things that, a computer just simply can't do, right? And again, even when you get into like what you're doing now for recruiting and for talent assessment and so on and so forth, I've actually been involved with where we do pre-screening with an AI bot type of person. And then, but you still need a recruiter who's going to go and then go through that and assess the talent and really try and get the intuitive pieces of it until AI gets to a point where it can be intuitive and so on. I don't think you have to worry about it. But even then, there's still going to need to be human intervention, I think, to run the teams that are implementing that technology. So for me, it doesn't really go away. It just changes, and I think if you look back at the way things were run 50 years ago, it's completely different, but there's still a human aspect that's in there.
Yeah, really interesting. Lots to come, I suspect, in this space, Steve, to talk about, I imagine. Steve, I have to bring this conversation to a close, but as I'm talking to you, I have a question in my mind that I'd love to finish up on. And that was, if you were a CEO now in a business, what would you be looking for from your chief people officer, your head of HR, whatever we want to call that role? What would you be looking for?
Well, I think it's circular back to what we started with, Shirley. Do they understand my business? Do they really understand the business? So I think if you come in, like, managing HR functions is one thing. Yeah, so I think understanding a compensation organization or a training organization or a systems organization within HR, that's something that has a specific skill set to it. And is frankly transferable across a lot of different businesses and industries and so on. HRIS is HRIS is HRIS, whether it's in finance, whether it's in medical physics, whether it's in pharmaceuticals. HRIS is HRIS. I think the real differentiator for HR leaders is, do you understand the business that you are in? And going back to that means, do you understand the finances? Do you understand the P&L? Do you understand how we make money? Do you understand how sales work? And then do you understand what levers can be pulled, or levers, if you're in the European market, can be pulled that are going to really impact the business? That's what I'd be looking for if I were a CEO. So if I were interviewing, for an HR leadership role, and the person was touting, well, here's what I've done in HR and in HR and in HR. That's a very generic, transferable skill set, to be able to say, yeah, I managed a comp function. Yeah, I managed an HRS function. I think the rubber will hit the road when you can say to that leader, here's how I see your business. Here's how I see us making money. And here's how I see my role being able to influence that on the profit and loss and cost management side and so on. You don't want to really always feel like it's distilling down to the dollar, but unless you're in a not-for-profit organization, that's the world we live in. And, all these companies exist to make a profit. And it's so much that you understand that and know where you can influence it. That's what I'd be looking for if I was a CEO, and if I was an HR professional, I'd be really spending and over investing my time in understanding how the business works.
It's a great synopsis, Steve. A very strategic view of HR, which I absolutely appreciate. Steve, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me on this conversation. I could talk to you for another hour, but we're busy people.
I appreciate the opportunity and the time, and it's always wonderful talking with you, Shirley.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. And I know for me, every conversation leaves me with something new to think about. So that you don't miss any of these episodes, you can subscribe to the Leadership Discoveries podcast. Do connect with me on LinkedIn or visit shirleykavanagh.com for more resources to help you reflect and support you in your own leadership journey. Until next time.